Hello, everyone. My name is Preston Dennett, and thank you for joining me for a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. I have a great episode for you today. I call this one Encounter on a Desert Highway. This is all about the UFO experiences of Susan Ware. She's had a lifetime of encounters, but there was an encounter in 1978 while driving through the deserts of central Utah that really changed her life. This has become a very well-known case, and in fact, it became the case of the year of 2023 for the Mutual UFO Network. Susan has worked with a lot of different researchers and people to investigate her case and uncover what happened, including, of course, myself. She reached out to me after hearing about my research, but she also worked directly with MUFON field investigator Richard Banasek and with Earl Grey. She worked with John Yost, a documentarian and an experiencer responsible for the book Alien Abduction Answers. She worked with the amazing Debs Shakti, a hypnotherapist who really helped her to remember what happened to her during this missing time encounter on a desert highway. So it's a truly incredible series of events, starting really all the way in early childhood up to pretty much the present day. Susan's case is covered in my book, Humanoids in High Strangeness, 20 True UFO Encounters, and that tells the whole story. She's also the subject of a documentary film by Steve Neal called The Jackrabbit Abduction. I'll have the link to that film in the show notes, so you can definitely check that out. But she's been on a number of podcasts, including The Lightgate, which I co-host with Dolly Safran, but also Spaced Out Radio with Dave Scott, UAP Podcast, a number of other different podcasts. So she's definitely getting the word out about her encounters. But in this particular episode, we're going to hear her whole story from beginning to end. And actually, I'm not going to start with her early childhood. I'm going to start actually when Susan was 18 years old in 1974. She was living in North Carolina, and she decided that she was going to join the Navy. So Susan did her boot camp in Orlando, Florida, and following this, she was stationed at Naval Air Station in Norfolk, Virginia. But she really wanted to travel beyond the East Coast, so she requested a transfer, and she hit the lottery. To her delight, she was transferred to Barbers Point, Naval Air Station in Oahu, Hawaii. By the way, this area does have a long history of UFO encounters. Now, Susan was a bit of a pioneer. She was assigned to a squadron of 400 men, and she was only one of 3 women in the squadron, and she was actually the first woman on the flight line in the C-130 and C-118 aircraft squadron. Her job involved checking the planes over, the batteries, the fuel, the anti-ice fluids, making sure everything was cleaned up and ready to go right back out after coming in. So she enjoyed this. It was satisfying work. She learned a lot, and a few times she did get to fly. And a few times she noticed strange anomalies in the sky, orange globe-like objects. She was unsure if these were military or not, but they didn't seem to be military because nobody was talking about it. And one time after seeing these things, she made the mistake of pointing one of them out to her superior and asking what it was. He was angry. He put his finger in her face and said, "If you want to be the first one transferred out of here, say another word about it." And this was not the only time this sort of thing happened. On another occasion, she was on the line waiting for a plane to come in and saw strange lights over the water. She later asked a bowling buddy about it, and he gave her this warning look, which clearly said, "We don't talk about things like that." So of course, she didn't. She did see another UFO once while flying in a C-130, and another time she was flying in a C-118 and saw a, quote, big white silver ball, which appeared to be pacing the plane. And before she could stop herself, she found herself asking, "What the heck is that?" Once again, her superior was not happy, put his finger in her face again and said, "You don't talk about that. You don't talk about it to me. You don't talk about that to anybody else unless you're planning your ticket out of here. So once again, she kept that to herself. It always felt like a secret that was never explained, and she had no idea that one day she would see and experience these things firsthand, and she would talk about it.
I saw a couple of things when we flew, and I remember the first time seeing something out the window and saying, "What's that?" And, everybody came over to the window and looked out. But as soon as I said, "What is it?" and it's like, "Oh, we don't talk about that. We don't talk about that at all. You don't talk to anybody about that." And I
What
got
did
the
you see?
finger in the face. It was an orange ball.
Uh-huh.
One time it was a dark gray ball, and one time it was an orange ball. One time it was between Hawaii and Kauai, and the other time, I think we were just out testing an engine, so we weren't very far. But I even asked somebody one time at the bowling alley, and they were like, "We don't talk about that." And I thought, what is the deal? It has to be something if nobody's talking about it.
Were you
Because,
thinking
I mean,
were you thinking it
if
was
I've seen it
UFOs?
and only flown a few times, how could they not see it all the time? Because they flew all over the Pacific. So,
Wow.
I was the first girl, and I was on the flight line, and I just learned real quick to keep my mouth shut.
Truly astonishing. She had several UFO sightings while in the Navy. And I think probably that's a lot more common than we hear about here in the civilian sector because most people don't talk about it. As we've seen, they're instructed not to. So kudos to Susan for having the courage to come forth and share that she actually did see UFOs while in the Navy. And of course, that wasn't the end of her encounters. Susan did really well in the Navy. She excelled. She made a lot of friends. She learned a lot. She actually moved up in rank to third class petty officer. But ultimately, she was transferred to NAS, Naval Air Station on the North Island of San Diego. This is in 1977. This was great because it allowed her more free time. She had her weekends free, so she could explore the beaches and the forests and the deserts of Southern California. She had a lot more free time. She had a lot of good friends. And it was then that she started to have some more really unusual experiences. In fact, in 1978, she and a group of friends took a cross-country camping trip, an off-road trip, into the Anza Borrego deserts of Southern California. And it was there she had a UFO encounter and an amazing incident involving a missing shoe. And this was a mystery that would take years to solve. So this next experience was in early 1978. She and her friends were camping out in the wilds of the Anza Borrego Desert in Southern California. They had enjoyed the evening and had all gone to bed. It was very early in the morning, about 3 a.m., Susan estimates. Everyone was quiet, and she woke up startled and noticed something bright moving in the sky overhead. The sky was full of stars. There was a new moon, so it was very noticeable. And she sat up and saw this blue-green, sort of egg-shaped object moving slowly and silently. And it approached to less than 1,000 feet, she estimates, but was still kind of on the other side of the cliffs surrounding them. And she watched in total disbelief as this object shot out smaller, sort of blue-green glowing spheres, which appeared to descend to the desert floor. Now, they were in a kind of a ravine, so her view was limited, but she was amazed at how beautiful the color of these things were. And she wondered what she was looking at. Could it be some kind of military training, some sort of new flare? Whatever this egg-shaped object was, it wasn't making any sound. And these objects going to the ground weren't making any sound either. So after watching these little orbs shoot out, this craft slowly floated to the east, and Susan went back to sleep. Now when she awoke, she started to get dressed, and this is when she noticed one of her shoes was missing. Now she did have it before she went to sleep, and now it was nowhere to be found. So she asked the guys, "Who took my shoe?" And they just kind of looked at her dumbly and said, "What are you talking about?" They thought she was joking and they laughed, but no, she was serious. And they all denied stealing her shoe. Why would they do that? So everyone gathered together and they searched the whole camp, but her shoe was nowhere to be found. So she did approach her best friend there, a gentleman by the name of Rick, and shared her UFO sighting that night, but he kind of just shrugged and said he didn't see anything, and apparently nobody else had. So everyone just kind of laughed about this missing shoe, except Susan. She didn't think it was particularly funny. They packed up the campsite and prepared to drive out. They were, again, off-roading. So they were driving along in this little convoy of jeeps. They had gone about a mile when the lead jeep stopped. One of the men got out and pointed up to the top of a sheer cliff and said, "Do you see what I see?" So Susan and everyone else peered up and stared in shock, and as Susan says, it was my shoe, and it was up on the very top of a pointed, sheer cliff. There was no reason my shoe would have been up there. So everyone began laughing. They were absolutely in shock. They were saying, "How did it get up there? That's hilarious. What did you do? How did it get there?" Susan, of course, denied going up there. There was no way. This was a mile away. There was no reasonable explanation. So two of the guys climbed up there. It was quite difficult. They retrieved it. They couldn't see any footprints around it. It looked as if it had been dropped from the sky. So this was a mystery that it looked like it would never be solved. But years later, the answer would come in a very unexpected way. So Susan had her shoe back. They continued their way out of the desert and came upon another puzzling mystery. They were driving up and came upon a tumble of boulders that were blocking their passage. So using pulleys and other jeeps, they were able to make it over the boulders, only to discover something that seemed impossible. That lying in the center of this ring of boulders was an old green Buick Electra with a black top. A car. It was weathered, rusted. It had clearly been there a long time. But there was just no way that this thing could have gotten there by itself. It was flatly impossible. It was far too large to have gotten over the boulders that were surrounding it. As Susan says, there is no way it could have gotten there other than if it was dropped from above. And that's exactly what she told everyone there. They all laughed, but they were all incredibly puzzled. They spent some time there examining this car, trying to figure it out. There were no license plates. It was empty of all belongings. So ultimately, it was just a weird mystery. One other thing that stood out on that Anza Borrego trip were these big jackrabbits that Susan kept watching crossing the highway on the way to the desert. She never forgot those, even though she only caught brief glimpses of them. She really wanted to see them again. And later she would, but not in the way she expected.
It was kind of odd because I remember waking up and there was an egg shape. Now, remember, we were in the ravine, and so the peaks were all around us on both sides. But there was an egg-shaped blue, kind of turquoisey blue thing that flew over. Total silence. You could hear the coyotes. You could hear the sounds of the desert. You could hear the fire crackling. These little do dots. Yeah, that's it. In the ravine where we were. So you could see it. You could see them shooting out, but you couldn't. I kept waiting for a sound when it hit the ground. An explosion, a pop, anything, nothing. It was just total silence. And I was in the green Jeep sleeping when I saw that. And I saw the guys all laying around. You could see on the picture laying around the fires. And it's really funny. I remember we needed more than one fire because there was some weird sounds out there. It's the Anza Borrego, and it's Coyote Canyon. And we had gone past the third watering hole way out into the Badlands. It was just wild out there. So I didn't much think anything about it until the next morning when I couldn't find my shoe. We looked everywhere. They all teased me, I'm like, you guys, somebody had to take my shoe because I had both shoes when I got in here. You can't be in the desert without something covering your foot. And we'd been out all day. And I had gotten in there and then taken my shoes off and gone to sleep. So the next day, just out of the blue, they were all joking because I was, saying, you guys, I want my shoe. And we got everything loaded up and kept going forward. We didn't backtrack. We went forward, deeper. And about a mile away, they found my shoe. They just stopped. What is that? And why is your shoe up there? It was a mile away. Nobody had left camp. Nobody had taken my shoe over there. It was bizarre. I could not figure it out. It's always been on my mind since 1970. This was probably early 78. And my first trip out there. So the guys climbed up and got the shoe. And, we did the whole investigation. There were no walking marks. There were no cave-ins around the shoe. There was nothing. It was just sitting on a sheer cliff by itself, just sitting there.
Susan's unexplained experiences were really just beginning, and in fact she would soon have one of the biggest of her entire life. In 1978, for a number of reasons, she decided to leave the Navy. She did really enjoy it there. It was very hard work. She learned a lot, but it just wasn't her life path. She really wanted to go visit her family back on the East Coast. So she decided that she was going to take a cross-country trip. She asked her friend Karen if she would like to join her, and they were planning to just take their time, visit various national parks, visit friends that they knew across the United States, and just have a good time sightseeing and seeing all the country across the United States. And then it turned out that one of the officers in her squadron also had family in North Carolina. He had just bought a brand new Volvo and he wanted to get it transferred to the East Coast. And he offered to pay Susan $1,500 if she would drive his car across the United States. So this was perfect. Brand new car, some spending money. Susan, of course, took the offer and she set off with Karen across the United States and what would be actually one of the most unusual experiences of both of their lives. It would change their lives forever. Susan and Karen were very excited about their trip across the United States. They left California and headed to Arizona. They spent some time visiting the Grand Canyon and then headed north to Cedar City, Utah. So they planned to drive through the night until they reached Grand Junction, Colorado. This is a distance of just under 400 miles. This would be a long night, but both of them felt up to it. It was a long 2-lane highway through the desert, and they knew it would be beautiful in this silvery moonlight. And as Susan says, Karen was driving that night after we gassed up. We were listening to music, and I was telling her a few stories about four-wheeling in the desert and those big old jackrabbits that were darting across the road just a few months ago in Borrego Springs. So it was about 9:30 p.m. as the moon began to peek over the tops of the mountains to their right, and it was just beginning to light up the desert floor through the passes and on the highway. The sky was crowded with stars. The traffic was almost non-existent as they passed by the small town of Enoch. You can see the route here, and it was shortly after passing Enoch that Susan began to notice something strange. They had driven some miles on this road when suddenly the moon had grown dark, and there was no longer any brightness shining on the desert floor. And she looked up and she couldn't even see any stars. So she turned to Karen again, who was driving, and said, "Where's the moon? Where are the stars? They don't just go out. The moon hasn't been up for more than a half an hour. Where did it go?" So Karen had no answer. They were just listening to the radio. Steely Dan, Dr. Wu, was blaring loudly into the night. Their windows were open to enjoy the warm night air, but this weird, unnatural darkness seemed to settle over the landscape and around them. And everything was just eerily dark. So she asked Karen again, "Where did the moon go?" And Karen said it was right there. So Susan's looking around and not seeing it and says, "The moon's not there. Where did it go?" And she couldn't see stars either. So this was really freaking them out. Karen slowed the car down and she began looking back and forth up through the windshield. Susan reclined her seat back, was checking both sides of the road and behind them and said, "I can't find the moon. There's no stars either." So this is when they started to feel a little bit of fear because they could not explain this. They were studying the landscape around them. It was as if they were driving through pure blackness. Really, the only thing visible was their headlights and the road ahead of them. And as Susan says, "I stuck my head out the window like a dog would, and I looked in every direction, and the moon was gone." So there was no traffic. It was really silent out. All they could hear was the music and the humming of their car. So they decided they would pull over at the next rest stop and check out what was happening. And then, without warning, Karen slammed on the brakes and stopped cold in the middle of the highway. And both women stared in front of them on the highway, trying to make sense of what they were looking at. And Susan actually let out a small scream, because as Susan says, it felt like time stood still. In front of us were about 20 big jackrabbits scattered on the road. They were huge, 3 feet tall, they had huge rabbit ears, and they weren't really moving, and they were all facing away from us. So while they looked like jackrabbits, it was obvious to both of them that there was something not right about them. They were far too large, they looked almost muscular, they were all standing perfectly still. There were far too many of them, and they were just about 15 feet in front of the car, scattered in a weirdly random pattern. So they both opened the car doors and stepped out and took a few steps, and they were standing there looking at these jackrabbits. And something seemed different to them. It was like time had shifted. Susan said it was almost as if things were moving in slow motion. At this point, Susan screamed out, "Where are the moon? Where are the stars? They're gone." It was at that second that the car engine stopped, the headlights went out, the song on the radio shut off, a surreal silence enveloped them, and at that moment everything changed. Because as Susan says, we stood there looking at the jackrabbits in the dark for just a split second. And then this huge, round, bright white light came down from something that was above us. It lit up the jackrabbits, us, and the car, and at the same time, every one of those giant jackrabbits turned around in slow motion and stared at us. Susan says they moved in unison. Immediately she felt herself gripped by a strange paralysis. She really wasn't sure if it was the fear or whatever it was that they were staring at, because as the jackrabbits turned around, they were not jackrabbits anymore. There was no big ears. They were grays. They had gray skin, giant black glistening eyes, really big eyes, so large and reflective that Susan could actually see the moon and the stars reflecting in their eyes. They were small, gray aliens. Both of them stood motionless. Neither of them could believe what they were seeing. There was no mistaking it. As Susan says, they were gray aliens, round-headed, giant-eyed beings, creatures. And with some of them, you could see the reflection of the moon and the stars in their eyes. So at this point, they both just completely panicked. Susan began screaming. Karen was struck dumb. Both of them seemed paralyzed. And that's all they could remember. The next thing they knew, hours had passed.
I noticed, and it's the weirdest feeling. I can feel it in me right now. It's like, wait a minute, the moon just came up. So where is it? And I remember Karen looking up, she was looking up. And it was so disturbing to me because all of a sudden it wasn't just the moon that was gone. It was the stars too. And it became unusually black. But our headlights, you could focus very well in front of us. And then all of a sudden, Karen came to a stop. And I remember I had just said, oh, here's something else. About 10 minutes before that, I was telling Karen stories about Rick and I and something we had seen, these weird jackrabbits. And they're kind of like, if you've ever seen a road runner, when it crosses the road, it's just, it's gone, gone. You don't see the body really. But that's when I had seen the jackrabbits. And I had told Karen about that. So when you put all this together, we're blinking our lights, driving down, and I'm talking about jackrabbits. Oh, I'd love to see some of those jackrabbits. And then I told her about it. And then the blackness starts. So all of a sudden, the car comes to a stop. And we weren't thinking, because at that point, something else had started taking over. Because we opened our doors and we got out and walked around to the front of the car with the headlights on. Now remember, it's pitch dark. The stars have disappeared and the moon had disappeared. And I remember reaching over and holding Karen's hand for a moment. And the reason she stopped is because there were giant jackrabbits in the road. Three, just like that, 3 or 4 feet tall, just scattered. And it was so weird because we knew it was strange, but we weren't in our right presence. There was just something that wasn't right. And as we look at them, all of a sudden there's a split second that now and the music was going really loud in the car. We were listening to Steely Dan, Katie lied, Dr. Wu, and it was blasting. So all the blasting was coming out. We got the light. It's the only reality that we have. And then all of a sudden, kaboom, the lights went out on the car stop. The music went silent, and these white, huge, the whitest white I have ever seen, came over us. Oh, I'm having trouble swallowing. Came over us, and it was in a circle all around the jackrabbits and us and the car. And at that split second, the jackrabbits all turned around just like this at the same time. They all went and looked at us, and they weren't jackrabbits. They were gray aliens, and I couldn't say that for years. Karen finally was the first one to say, were they gray aliens? And I finally were like, yes, I can say it. And that was just last year. That was this year that I've just been able to say that. And they turned around, their eyes were gigantic, and when I screamed, where is the moon and the stars, they were in the eyes of those aliens. The moon and the stars were in those gigantic eyes, and they all moved so weird in slow motion, very weird.
So this was a very strange series of events. The stars and the moon disappearing, coming to a stop in the middle of the highway and seeing all these jackrabbits, these rabbits turning around and revealing themselves to be gray ETs, seeing a light coming from above, and then the next thing Susan and Karen know, they are waking up in a diner. They later found out it's Randy's Diner in Grand Junction, Colorado. They were sitting at a table. They were very tired, very disoriented. There was a waitress there who shook them awake and said, honey, it's time to wake up now. And they looked around in absolute confusion because they were no longer on this desert highway in Utah. They were in this diner, and it was morning. They looked at the clock. It was 6:28 a.m. And it slowly dawned on them that they were missing hours of time. It ended up being about 9 hours of time, and they were over 100, 200 miles away from their original location. So this began a real journey of discovery of what happened during this missing time. Years following this incident, Susan did some research, and they now believe that the diner that they woke up in was Randy's Diner. You can see it here. The waitress told them that she actually watched them pull up in the Volvo, come inside the diner, and just lay their heads on the table as if they were exhausted. And she said they lay there for about 10 minutes when finally she walked up to them and woke them up. So when they woke up, both Susan and Karen had a raging thirst. They were parched. They ordered glasses of water and a couple of Dr. Peppers and tried to figure out what had just happened. They quickly downed their drinks and asked for more. Both felt really ill. They were flushed, nauseous. Their skin felt like it was on fire. They had really dry mouths. It looked almost as if their eyebrows and hair had been singed. Both of them were disoriented to the point that they had trouble thinking and even speaking. Neither of them had any memory of how they had gotten there. And as Susan says, I was covered with burns. I was nauseous. I felt sick. And blisters were starting to form on my face, neck, and stomach. So as she sat there, Susan immediately began having flashbacks. She, of course, remembered the car stopping, the jackrabbits on the highway. She remembered getting out and screaming when these rabbits turned around to reveal themselves as gray aliens. She remembers the light coming down from above and screaming. She also recalled other flashes of memory. One was particularly vivid. She recalled dropping down from the sky at a very high altitude. The wind was roaring around her. She could see the red desert landscape below her. She also had flashbacks of being in a strange, foggy room. It was very clear to her what had happened. She had been taken on board a UFO, and these were gray aliens. But the whole idea of it was so staggering, so unbelievable. She could barely process it. She could barely talk about it, especially because Karen didn't remember any of this. The last thing Karen remembered was watching the sunset in Cedar City before they even began driving through the desert. So after sitting there in the diner for a short while, they found a cheap motel, and they spent the next 2 days recovering. Neither of them spoke much about what happened. They did check the car, and they found that the odometer was missing about 400 miles from their trip. And the gas, too. They were making careful notations of the gas and the miles driven, so they were absolutely certain about this. So that was weird, but they were determined to continue their trip, so they moved on. They visited Pikes Peak in Colorado, and then Lake Dillon. They still had to deliver this car to North Carolina, and they were determined to have fun while doing it. They did occasionally discuss what happened. They asked each other, how the hell did this happen? Several times. Like, where were we? But at the same time, they felt unable to say much more about it, especially because 9 hours of time were missing. And as Susan says, it really messes up your mind when something totally unexplained happens, and then you can't even talk about it to the one person that it happened with. Sharing something so traumatizing seemed to block my memory. It also gave me deep fear to try and think about it too much at any one time, because I got those memory flashes that made no sense. They were alarming in every way. I remembered those huge black eyes filled with stars, and the car turning off, and the music falling silent, all in the same moment. I remember falling in my dress through space, through the sky, from so high up I could see the curvature of the earth. I could clearly see the blazing bright sun beginning to rise and splash bright red light onto the ground below me. I was falling super fast, and I could hear gusting winds and feel the searing heat as the sun came over the east to below. I remember all the red rocks and mesas and rock formations below me glowing as I got closer to Earth. I remember falling through what I knew were layers of atmosphere, blacks, blues, and then the Earth below me. I was afraid of hitting the ground. And then I woke up with Karen in that blasted diner at 6:28 a.m. with splotchy burns on my body. So they continued the drive through Kansas and then Missouri, turning north in St. Louis and driving up to some friend's home in Elgin, Illinois. And slowly they began to return to a semblance of normalcy. They stayed there for a while, then went to Wisconsin where they stayed with other friends, stayed there a little while, and then decided to just drive to Susan's family in North Carolina. It was now September 23rd. They had been on the road for about 10 days. And during all this time, Susan still felt the presence of the ETs around her. As she says, I still felt like they were kind of with me the whole trip, like watching us. I had this weird paranoia during the whole thing. So she stayed at her home for a few weeks, started to get really sick again. It happened very quickly. She had an intense pain on her lower right side. She developed a 103-degree fever pretty much overnight, vomiting, diarrhea. Her father bought her some medicine, and Susan basically went into a deep sleep for 2 days. And when she woke up, she was feeling much better. All the pain in her side was gone. She now wonders if perhaps the ETs came back and healed her. As she says, was it divine intervention? I'm thinking it was probably a different kind of intervention. I think it was a healing from whatever happened, but I don't have any proof of that.
We woke up in a diner in Colorado. Just like that. Our heads were down. My mouth got real dry talking like this. This is the first time I've ever really said it. Except to Karen. And I'm sure she probably remembers mine because we said, where are we? What are we doing here? Total panic, absolute terror. And we were covered in radiation burns, like blistered. Blisters had started. They weren't all blistered. Some of them they were just red raised splotches. And really nauseous, super dry mouth. I felt like my sinuses, my whole body was dried up. Which, you could rationalize that as, we've been a desert rat for 24 hours, but that's not how. There was just something really wrong because we were in this diner. And how we woke up was she came from behind and she said, honey, time to wake up now. The waitress did. And where are we? Oh my God, what are we doing here? Karen and I totally lost. We just had a weird expression. I don't even know if I could ever even know that expression. It was scared. It was lost. Wounded. It was like everything all at once. And I said, what time is it? And she said 6:28 a.m. And the clock was on the wall and the sun was coming up. And our car was parked in the front of this diner out the big windows where we could see it. And I said, how long have we been here? And she said, 10 or 15 minutes. Can I get you anything? And we're like, Dr. Pepper, soda, water, everything. And what the problem was that we couldn't talk about it. It was so odd looking at her, 2 feet away. And we couldn't speak of it. It's like the words, something stopped it between your brain and your mouth. But the terror was in your heart. But at the same time that I couldn't speak, I was having this. This was the most terrorizing part. I remembered falling from the sky. And I fell for a long time. And I saw the curve of the earth. I saw the curve of the earth. That's the picture. And I saw the sun coming up. And I saw it literally coming through the points of the different points of between the mountains. The sun came in and lit up the desert, which was all red rock. Everything in that area, Grand Junction, is all red rock. And I saw it. And that really messed my mind up because I could feel it. I could feel the burn. I think that's probably where I got the radiation burns. I could feel the burning of my skin. I felt like my eyebrows had singed off. And to this day, I have like 0 hair on my arms. It's never come back. And I itched all over. And all this was going through my head. And I don't know what we did, or I know we went to a hotel, and I know it was some gross hotel, like cinder blocks, maybe, like an old hotel. But, this was the 70s, and it was in the highway, and it was in the middle of the desert. So it's not like it was now, but it was kind of like a Route 66 hotel. We noticed that when we got back in the car and we were writing down the numbers, we still had gas in the tank. And we didn't have that 335 miles on the odometer. So that tells me the car had to be taken with us. And it had to be laid down there. That's why I had asked the waitress, did you see us pull in? And she said, no, I just looked up and you were there. So it's like, I still wish I would have known. And they didn't have cameras like they do now, or that would have been the first thing I did to see, did I come out of the sky or did we drive up or what? Because she did say Karen was driving. And I do have a memory before the hypnosis of exiting the car and standing, and then Karen and I looked across the street to this giant red rock. It was a single, the red big mesa, all by itself, was across the street out the diner. We didn't know how to go back. You had to go forward because there was no going back. Going back was impossible to talk about it. And the more we tried, the more the block came, and you could feel like an oppression. I don't know how to say it, but you could feel like a pressure. Like you were never alone, like the whole rest of the trip. But we ended up going to Pikes Peak, which, 14,000 feet. I remember seeing black smoke come out the back of the car. And then 2 days later, I got really sick. Like, so sick that Daddy was having to carry me with projectile vomiting. And let's just say I had it from both ends. It was that bad. And my stepmother wrapped me in a towel while Daddy carried me to the bathroom because I was completely unable to walk. I was so sick. I hurt so bad on my right side, I thought I was going to die. I didn't know how long I had been asleep, but I wasn't hurting and I wasn't sick. I drank a whole lot, and I remember just laying on the sofa, watching TV for about 2 or 3 days. And I didn't talk about what had happened, but I figured my daddy knew because I had told him, and I remember little pieces of telling him the story. And I know that he just couldn't understand because I've got the burns on me. I got the marks on me. On my back, I have 3 marks that look like giant exploded blood vessels. One here, one here, one here. Just boom, boom, boom. One on each side of my spine, and then one shortly off to the side of my spine. And they just look like dark red blood vessels, which have been there since that day.
So now that she's back in her family's home in North Carolina, she's pretty much fully recovered, at least physically, from this incredible encounter in Utah. Mentally, it's another thing. She was really confused about what had happened. There wasn't a lot of people that she could talk to about this. She did try to tell her family, and while they were very supportive, they did not know what to make of it. And Susan herself became quite obsessed with this encounter. What happened? Who were these jackrabbits? These were ETs. That was pretty clear to her. Karen didn't remember really any of this, so she was largely alone with all of this. But now she did have the time to sort of just sit back and think about it. And one of the things she started to think about was the fact that as a young girl, she did have some really unusual encounters, including what appears to be an encounter with gray ETs. It was around age 4 that Susan woke up one evening to see a stranger peering into the window of her front door. Now, she couldn't quite remember what the face looked like, only that he looked very different from a normal human. And it frightened her so bad that she actually climbed right over the radiator to get back into her room, hid under the covers, peeked outside, but whatever it was gone. The next morning, Susan's mother noticed that her knees were a little burned, and Susan explained that she had climbed on the radiator, but didn't say anything about the weird face that she had seen looking at her through the window. And this same sort of event happened at least twice more that she can remember. At age 5, they moved to a new house, but these weird experiences continued. In fact, one evening, Susan woke up to find herself outside the house with no idea how she got there. As she says, "I got outside and I had to crawl in one night. I don't remember how I got outside." And it was around this time that Susan began having a series of very disturbing and vivid dreams about war. As she says, "I used to have these awful dreams and nightmares of military tanks on my street in my tiny little neighborhood in North Carolina. Tanks on the street plowing over everybody's cars, over the trees and homes, everything." So these nightmares puzzled her. She had no idea where they came from. She was so young. She had never been exposed to anything like this. and yet these dreams repeated over and over again. Kind of like a warning is how she interpreted it. And it was during this time that Susan began to develop a very strong interest in nature. She would spend many hours out in the backyard woods near her home. And as she says, I just remember being very in tune with every animal in the forest. She also started having psychic experiences. She became very intuitive and psychic. This was a talent which would definitely help her throughout her life. But other than sometimes clashing with her mother, she had a very happy childhood. She did have some weird experiences, but she took them in stride. She got good grades in school, she had lots of friends, and before she knew it, she was an adult. She joined the Navy, and then of course she had this amazing encounter in 1978 on this desert highway in Utah.
And that way I could see a straight line to where the front door is in the living room, and I could hear my dad come home because he was a cop and he'd come home about 11. But I guess he was already home and I had missed it. But I heard the handle on the door. And this is when we lived on the plaza in Charlotte in a little small house. And when I looked, there was a weird face in those 3 little windows at the top of the door. There was a weird face. It was like a big head and big eyes and weird. And I remember I needed to go to the bathroom, so I rolled off the bed, like tactical manner. And I crawled on my hands and knees as fast as I could to the bathroom, which is a central hallway, and my parents' room was next door, but my brother was in the same room as I was. And I remember hitting that heated grate on the heater in the floor, and it just burned my knees. But I went to the bathroom, and then I was real careful, but I don't know why, but I couldn't look at the door. It scared me so bad. I remember being in total panic mode. And I just went back to the bed and covered up my head, But then I would see, they're at the window. And in the summer, the window was always open because there was no AC back then. And
Right.
of course, it wasn't as hot as it is now, but we just always had, the crickets out. It was just a normal, that's what you did back then. Yeah, yes, I was having recurrent dreams that would show me tanks in the streets, like military tanks, and chaos and explosions and loud sirens, and it was so chaotic in my dreams. Sometimes I couldn't stand it, and it would flash like so it wasn't a regular dream. It was almost like a strobe kind of effect. Yeah, and it even bothered me my whole life. I couldn't stand, even as a teenager, you go to parties and they got a strobe. It's like, oh, nope, no strobe for me. Find myself sleepwalking in the yard, and I don't, in my little jammies, and I couldn't get back in unless the door was unlocked, and sometimes they would leave it unlocked. But I couldn't get in because the windows were way up off the ground.
So now we move up to the present. She's living in North Carolina following this incredible encounter in 1978 on this desert highway in Utah, which totally changed her life. She knew something had happened. The images of what she'd experienced, the graves, seeing herself high above the earth, were flashing through her mind. It started to cause her some anxiety. She didn't like driving alone at night. Ultimately, she wasn't happy living on the East Coast, so she moved with her husband. They got married to California. They tried to have children, but ended up having a couple of miscarriages. So this was very difficult for her, and ultimately she just tried to live a normal life and shoved this experience out of her mind and move on with life. But of course, this didn't turn out quite the way she expected. When contactees usually have a lifetime of unusual experiences. And certainly that was true with Susan, because one time she went out camping with her husband and a really good friend, and they started having some unusual encounters with what they believed to be Bigfoot. One of Susan's favorite places to go camping was in Julian in Southern California. This area is surrounded by forested wilderness, and she and her husband and their friend just loved camping at Lake Cuyamaca. And with their military training, they were easily able to navigate through the wilderness, which they often did. On one memorable occasion, they got to a favorite meadow, which they knew pretty well, and this is when the fog suddenly moved in. And to their surprise, they found themselves lost and disoriented. They couldn't hear any traffic on the road. It was clear to them that they did not know where they were. It was starting to get dark and chilly. And this is when they began to hear this creepy sound of big branches snapping on the edge of the meadow. It sounded to Susan like a massive creature, but they weren't able to see any animals because of the fog and the darkness. But Susan remembers it well, because she had the urge to run, but she knew that if this was a bear, running would probably be a bad idea. And she had this weird feeling that it was watching them, and she was sort of drawn to follow the sounds of the footsteps along the edge of the meadow. As Susan says, we kind of followed the crunching, and it took us to the road. It was almost like whatever was out there knew that we were lost, and we followed it. It always kept the same distance. The next thing we knew, we're on the road. We don't know what led us, but we were all led. Whatever it was big. I always thought it was walking on 2 feet versus 4 feet. That's why it was so creepy. I was drawn to follow it and had not felt that feeling in those woods before. I had felt the strangeness in the desert, but never in the mountains of Julian. This area has always been a safe zone for camping. Now, was this a Bigfoot? It could be. I looked it up. There is a history of Bigfoot encounters in this area, but they never really discussed it. And it was only a few weeks later, while camping near this same area at the Paso Picacho campgrounds, that she and her husband and this same friend had another experience, which made it clear, certainly to Susan, that Bigfoot was in fact in this area. This was still a pretty remote area at that time, with camping spots that were widely separated and private. So they spent the day hiking around and enjoying the serene beauty of Lake Cuyamaca and all the forests and creeks. And when night arrived, they returned to their campsite. They set up a small dome tent, which they all shared. They got in the tent, and they were sleeping in their sleeping bags. They had a campfire which had just burned down, and at some point during the night they were all asleep, but Susan was awakened by movement outside the tent. At first she wasn't really startled, but she became aware that someone or something was walking around her campsite. She could actually hear it fumbling around with an empty bottle, and in the next few seconds she became quite frightened, because she went from wondering what this sound was to seeing a big dark shadow between the flickering fire and the thin nylon tent. So whatever was out there was just a few feet away from her, and then in a split second, looking through the thin nylon tent fabric, Susan saw a giant arm reach over the top of the tent and actually push down the center top directly over her. It made a squishing sound when it hit the tent. She saw an impression of a giant hand. Without thinking what she was doing, she just reacted instinctively. She reached up and pushed her own hand on this other hand and screamed, "Get out!" Now this hand was easily twice the size of her own hand. It had fingers. She could clearly feel them through the tent. And as Susan says, it was like giving a high five to a giant strong hand. It instantly drew back when I screamed. I heard whatever it was leave with a few quick steps away towards the back of the tent, and then head into the woods by the trail, and then silence. Total silence in the woods. So Susan screamed, waking up the other two. She told them what happened, but they accused her of dreaming the whole thing. Susan insisted that she was awake. She also noticed this musty, swampy, kind of wet dog smell in the campsite through the tent that had not been there before. She knew it was the smell of whatever that thing was, and she was creeped out because she had actually almost touched this thing. She lay there awake for some time, making sure that whatever this was not returning. She kind of knows what it was. She thinks it was a Bigfoot. But after hearing the sounds of the forest returning, Listening to the fire crackling, she went back to sleep. The next morning, she again explained what happened, and they both told her she must have been dreaming. But as Susan says, little did they know that a big creature on 2 legs, very tall and stinky, had walked into our camp, touched the glass bottle and made it move on the ground, which woke me up. Then it made a giant shadow on the tent, and its giant hand had literally pushed the top of the tent down to within a foot of my face. And I had slapped it and screamed, and it ran away. It was on 2 feet. This was not a 4-footed creature. It stunk, and its steps were gigantic, and it got away so fast. That was the weirdest thing.
That was near Julian, and it was so simple. I sat up at night. I could see the fire flickering. We had been drinking a little bit that night, and there was a bottle with clink. And my husband was beside me, and Jackie was with me, and I saw that monster. I saw the hand, gigantic. I could hear him breathing, and he pushed the top of our tent down, and it was like this close to my head, and I screamed, "Get out!" And I remember it was like high-fiving the Bigfoot. It was gigantic. The hand was powerful, and I heard boom, 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 and it left, and I was shaking. Jackie had jumped up, and she was on me, and Chuck was under us, and he came up like, "What happened?" Like nobody knew what happened but me. I had just touched a Bigfoot, and I know that that's what it was, because if it was a bear, we would have been eaten. We would have been mauled, and that tent would have been torn up. So, and honestly, it had this feeling like a human hand. I felt the energy of that thing. It was gigantic, and the palm was as big as my whole hand. And I heard the from him or it left off the back of the tent. And it's the same place that 2 weeks or 3 weeks before we had this weird fog move in, and I had followed the sound of whatever that was in the woods until we got to the road. And I think it was the same thing. So that was up at Paso Picacho outside of Julian. I think they're all related. All of that's related. Experience one, you're open to enough, or something clicks in you that you're accepting to that, because it wasn't so scary until it came down on my head. Once I touched it and pushed with all my might, screamed, "Get out of here!" It did. It did. And we went back to that campground many times and never had anything like that. Oh, it stunk. That's what they could smell it. That's the whole thing. They could smell it too. So it definitely happened, because I was already sitting up and very aware of, oh, something's out there. The first thing I thought was, it could be a bear. And we were very prepared that we didn't have anything in the tent with us, and everything was locked in the car. But that doesn't always stop them from coming in anyway. So
once again, Susan found herself pretty much alone and isolated with her unusual experiences, particularly that second one, the Bigfoot pushing its hand down in the tent. She was the only one who experienced that. So that's an added level of stress, certainly. But life goes on. She and her husband finally were successful. They had 2 kids, a son and a daughter. But following the birth of her son a couple of years later, she started experiencing some gynecological problems that ultimately necessitated having a hysterectomy. And it was following this that she found out some medical mysteries about herself that really puzzled her doctor and, of course, Susan. Following Susan's surgery, the doctor wanted to speak to her, and he told her everything went fine, but I've never seen anything like what I found in you. Your right ovary has totally disappeared down to a little scar tissue. It was totally missing. And he told her that it looked as though her appendix had exploded at some prior time, that there was evidence of a prior surgery, with cauterization, exposure to high heat. It looked like there was a little laser scar on the appendix. Whatever had occurred, the doctor said it had been done years ago. He said he had never seen what he found inside her appendix, these small little pellet-sized balls of hard matter. So he couldn't be sure what that was. He was baffled by it, and he looked at Susan with questioning eyes, asked her if she had ever had surgery before. Because in her paperwork she said that no, she had never had surgery other than a brief surgery on her left ankle. So she had no idea how to explain what he was telling her. And the doctor said, well, in your belly button you've got this inch-long scar. You've had some kind of surgery, or we wouldn't have found all this. Now Susan knew she had never had surgery. She didn't know what to say about all of this. She had no answer. So she and her doctor were equally confused. She left the hospital 2 days later to recoup at home and then returned to work. She often thought about the doctor's findings, didn't share it with anyone. It was all too strange and confusing. So she had no idea what had happened to her, and she had no way to explain it. She did wonder if this whole thing had something to do with that strange encounter in the desert years earlier in 1978, those 9 hours of missing time. And she wondered perhaps if this was a healing or intervention from these beings. What else could she think? It was just another strange, unexplained occurrence. And once again, there was no one to talk to about it.
So here's the real grabber here. After I had my children, I couldn't get my period right, and I just was sick for 3 years. And I had gone to 2 different doctors. We got to do something. So I finally went to a doctor in Ventura, and he said, well, okay, I got a couple of options. And I said, no, let's just have a hysterectomy. That's the only option. Let's just do it. I don't want any more children, and I can't stand living and, that controlling me anymore, because I was a fun person, and it was bothering me. So I go in and have the hysterectomy, and the next morning when the doctor comes in, he says, you told me you had never had surgery before. And I said, no, I hadn't. But while I was pregnant with my daughter, I had a hip cast on, and I was on a walker, and 8 surgeries on my ankle, but never have I had any kind of surgery, my girly parts. So he said, well, that's really bizarre, because what I found was on your right side where you're having all that pain, your right ovary was missing, and the fallopian tube had been attached to your appendix, and at some time your appendix had exploded or burst and then been folded up nice and neat and sealed with some kind of high cauterization like a laser, and we don't use that. So what is this? And I had no idea. I knew, but I wasn't about to say, oh, that's when I got beamed up. I mean, you just don't do that. So, he asked me again later on that day. I am so confused by this. Oh, and then he told me inside when he had taken my appendix out, he said, here's the real kicker. When I took your appendix out, inside it was a sack of pellet-sized, like hard, rocky, like raisin pellets. It was full of those. And I don't even know what those are. So we're going to send this off. Well, I never heard about that again, what that was. And I don't know if he sent it off. But I was so weirded out, the fact that he found something foreign in me, and that I had conceived 2 kids and only had 1 left ovary. And I had, all that time I had all that pain on that side. So what do you say to that?
Once again, Susan found these unexplained experiences kind of stacking up in her life. UFO sightings, medical mysteries, Bigfoot encounters, and of course it was more than that. The vast majority of UFO contactees started experiencing a profound number of paranormal and psychic experiences. And that was absolutely true with Susan. It became an almost daily thing with little premonitions and synchronicities and just paranormal events of all kinds. And in fact, there were so many of them, she's kind of earned this nickname, which they would call Susan's World, because she lived in this world of unexplained events, and everyone who knew her became aware of this because it was so common for Susan. One memorable psychic event occurred one evening when Susan's daughter came home from a date, and Susan could tell she was lying about where she had been. So she listened to the story and said, "That's weird, because I saw you in somebody's basement drinking beer and playing charades." And her daughter became immediately frustrated because this was something her mother always did. And Susan's daughter admitted, "Well, that's exactly what I did." She couldn't lie to her mother because her mom was remote viewing her. As Susan says, "I knew. I literally saw her. I was in the room with her. I didn't want to be. It's not like I tried to see what she was doing." Her son was a little bit more rebellious, and occasionally Susan had to drive around to find him, and she learned that if she just mentally asked for help, she could locate him. And as Susan says, "I would say, 'Angels, can you just show me where he is?' And every single time, it never failed, the next turn I made, the car lights would shine on him, he would get in the car, and I would bring him home. So there's some kind of guidance." So these weird psychic events and intuitions and synchronicities were a pretty much daily occurrence. Became very well known among Susan's family and friends, became a well-worn joke. They called it Susan's World. Life marched on. Susan didn't share her UFO experiences with anyone. She tried, but nobody around her showed any real interest in this subject. And besides, her own experiences seemed to have come to an end. But still in the back of her mind, she knew that one day she would have to explore what happened to her. And this encounter continued to affect her. As she says, "I had a major fear of a lot of things. I feared it would happen again. I was afraid to be alone." She deliberately avoided going anywhere near Utah. Only later did she consciously realize that this was probably because of that encounter and that she might have a repeat experience. Sadly, in 2002, Susan's father passed away. The evening of the funeral, she and her sister stayed up late looking through a photo album and reminiscing. And that's when they saw this cluster of sparkly lights appear in the corner of the room. And Susan knew instantly that it was her father. She could sense it. Both she and her sister observed these lights until Susan became overcome with curiosity, and she walked up to them and stuck her hand among them, and she immediately could feel her father's presence. As she says, "It was like a last hug goodbye." Her sister was frightened, but Susan found the experience comforting.
And all through my life, I would see what was getting ready to happen. And when you got kids, you got to kind of like stop it, because if you don't, you're going to have a disaster. Because my son was very, very active and not the usual. And he took a lot of time. And that was my superpower. Every time he ran away to find him, I literally would say out loud, "Angels, I need you now," as I'm driving. I would just scream it out, "Angels, I need you now." And every time I would know exactly where to turn, and the lights would hit him, and he'd go, "Oh," and he'd get in the car.
Yeah, pretty much all the contactees I've interviewed experienced many paranormal and psychic events. So in a way, that's not all that unusual. But for the people who have to deal with this, yeah, it can be stressful. So Susan has pretty much moved on with her life. Her kids grew up, they moved out. She and her husband became empty nesters. And at that point, she discovered her husband's infidelities. And she and her husband decided to separate. And this allowed Susan a lot more free time to work on herself and really think about her life path and all the things that had happened to her. She's a very successful artist. You can see some of the drawings of her experiences in this video. She makes little mermaid houses and things like this. So she's really working on herself. And it became time to sort of look back on her life and look into this one experience on the desert highway in 1978 with this UFO encounter to try to figure out what happened. She finally felt like she had found the strength and courage to really face this head on in a way that she had never done before. And this is where it got super interesting, because it was on May 3rd, 2022 that she decided, you know what, I'm just going to go to my computer, type in the word UFO, and see what I can find. And by this incredible synchronicity, what came up was a film called Alien Abduction Answers by John Yost. It had been released that very day. This was such an incredible synchronicity that she ended up reaching out to John Yost. And this really began her journey of discovery and healing to figure out what exactly happened to her on that fateful night in 1978 on this desert highway in Utah. So looking at this movie, Alien Abduction Answers by John Yost, Susan learned that he himself was an experiencer, seeking answers, and that his movie was part of his journey to find answers. It was so weird that that movie was premiering that very day. The synchronicity was so incredible that Susan decided to buy the movie, but it filled her with anxiety. It took her a long time to watch this movie. She kept turning it off because everything felt so familiar that it made her anxious and almost nauseous. It made her own experience come rushing back to her, almost to the point that she was reliving it. So this was an incredible revelation for her. So after watching this movie, she knew that the time had come to allow herself to confront her experience. She knew it was time to investigate the facts of that strange encounter in the desert. As Susan says, I've always known it wasn't time to talk about it, but John's movie said it's time. So she reached out to him, and to her surprise, he wrote back to her. And after hearing about her experiences, John suggested that she contact Debs Shakti Buller, a quantum hypnotherapist who was featured in this film. So Susan did her research on Debs and was very pleased with her approach to this subject and booked a session. She was very nervous on the day of the session, but at the same time, she felt as though John Yost had almost saved her life by making this movie. So despite her anxiety, she moved forward with hypnosis, and to her delight, this session was a huge success. She was able to relive the experience as kind of, quote, an objective reporter. With Deb's skillful guidance, she was taken back to that fateful night in September 1978 as she and Karen drove along this remote desert highway in Utah. Under hypnosis, she recalled driving by the little town of Enoch at about 9:30. She relived watching the sun go down, the stars filling up the desert sky, the moon rising to her right low over the mountain range, and then suddenly noticing that the moon had disappeared. She relived the car coming to a stop and staring in shock at these giant jackrabbits standing like sentries on the highway in front of them. She and Karen stepped out of the car and were staring in alarm at these unmoving figures, 20 or more of these giant jackrabbits just standing there. She remembered the car headlights going dark, the engine going off, the deafening silence as the music died away, and then a blinding bright light shining down from above, and that's when Susan let out a soft scream.
The first 17 seconds, I just melted into a pile of tears out of my chair, onto my bed, fetal position, first 17 seconds. It was all the terror, everything. So I watched the first 5 minutes, getting creeped out, hair on my body standing up, feeling nauseous, blink, 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 memory. It was not comfortable. And then turned it off. A few minutes later, came back, turned it off. I had to process it and digest it for a while. And the day after, I have never, ever done this in my whole life. I am not a celebrity kind of person. Everybody's good at something and special at something, and so I've never really thought celebrities like celebrity. But I reached out to John on Facebook and I said, help, I just watched your movie. And it triggered everything in me. And now I need help.
Prior to going under hypnosis, Susan really had no memory of what happened during this missing time. Of course, she did remember all the events leading up to it. But 9 hours of missing time is quite a long time. So she was very curious to find out what she would remember under hypnosis. And of course, it was very successful. She remembered being taken on board a craft and all the events that occurred when she was on board. Susan was amazed at what she recalled. As she says, I saw myself floating up, and I saw the car float up, and being in that room that had no corners. It was a curved environment that glowed a soft blue everywhere, not bright, but soft blue. Everything looked fuzzy, kind of like a hologram, because I could see through it. I was sitting on a table with my feet hanging down. Even the floor looked fuzzy. I was alone, but looked around for my friend Karen, and there was what looked like a railing, but it wasn't attached to any kind of wall. It just floated about 5 feet in front of me. I could not move my head to look around, but the floor and ceiling appeared amorphous. So this room was small, the lighting in it was diffuse, slightly blurred, but standing directly next to Susan, she could see a small gray E.T. It had light-colored skin, but had the same dark eyes and large bald head, and like the rest of the room, it looked a little blurred to her. So Susan's eyes met the gray, and she asked telepathically, "Can I touch you?" The gray being assented, said yes, so Susan reached out and ran her fingers down its arm, and she said the skin felt tight, kind of waxy and cold. It seemed to wrinkle slightly under her touch. It reminded her of thin styrofoam wrapping used in packing, and she quickly withdrew her hand in disgust, thinking to herself, "Ew." Now this seemed to amuse the gray. He seemed to be amused at her reaction, and he replied telepathically, "No, not ew. You are me, and I am you." So she asked, "Where's Karen?" The little gray replied, "She is with you, having her own experience." This is when Susan's attention was drawn to these silver rails because there was movement above them. She could now see these images flashing rapidly, blinking, and she was absolutely shocked by what they showed. As Susan says, the images were exactly the same thing that I remember seeing in those recurring dreams as a child. The military tanks in the street, bombs and destruction around us, dark skies, and starvation. She felt the same dire warning that she had felt as a child, which was, quote, "If we don't change our ways, and you can't make a difference, this will happen. We would have wars in our streets and chaos. Every one of you has got to make a change, because if you don't, this is what's going to happen." As Susan says, "It stressed my responsibility as a human being to do my best and pass on the word to others." Susan was then instructed to lay down on this table. The beings began to work on her body. She felt a brief moment of pain on her right side where her right ovary was. She saw them use a tool of some kind on the left side of her neck. They then rolled her over and did something to her back. It wasn't too painful, but she did feel some pressure. And she says, "They felt like pressure from some kind of air gun going into me. I flinched and pulled away." But afterwards, she sat back up and again asked where her friend Karen was, and the gray repeated, "She is with you. She is having her own experience." Susan wanted to turn around, but she couldn't. And as Susan says, "I couldn't see her or find her. I could only move a little bit, but I couldn't turn around." Now she did have a distinct and very clear mental impression that they were far above the earth and surrounded by stars. She could see it in her head. Even though she didn't look out any windows, she knew she was above the earth. And the next thing Susan recalled, she was dropping out of the craft, flying through the sky, plummeting towards the earth at great speed, straight down. As Susan says, "I was coming down, going through layers and layers of atmosphere and what felt like clouds. I could see the curve of the earth below me. The sun wasn't up from the mountains yet, but while I was falling, I could see the rays of the sun illuminated across the red ground below me. The red sun shone through the mountain passes below until it rose enough to cover the whole ground below with red sunrise. Every red bluff and mesa were lit up like fire. I could feel the moisture. I could hear the whoosh of the air speeding past me. I remember burning. I felt the sun or something like a hot knife burning my skin. And I knew that was when I had gotten these burns. but it was a beautiful sight from above, especially when I got to the red rock below. I remember being so scared that I was going to go splat when I hit the ground. The fear at that time was immeasurable, pure adrenaline craziness, like jumping out of an airplane with no parachute, because all that reasoning was going on. Why am I here? How am I falling through the sky? Oh my God, I can see the curve of the earth. My mind was going through what I was seeing and was trying to reason. I could feel the burns. I could see the earth. And then instantly, I was inside the diner with Karen and was waking up. Of the entire experience, it was this part that frightened Susan most. At no point did she feel this experience was malicious, but the feeling of being burned was, as she says, awful. So she did also remember getting a glimpse of this craft that she had been inside. As she says, it had a flat bottom, and the top looked like an egg, but more rounded. It was huge. Whatever it was huge, because it blocked out the moon and the stars above it.
I wanted to go to where the doors were open on the car. I want to know why the heck we got out of the car and we didn't just like plow through those rabbits, which I love animals, and Karen did too. But in today's world, I think we would have just gone zoom and flown by. But we were just not. We were taken over by something else already. And all I can say is I didn't see it, but I felt it, and it was huge, gigantic, because it blocked out all of the light from mountain to mountain, literally from side to side of the road, completely blacked out. And it had to be huge. So all of these memories came flooding back. And when I was under hypnosis, I remember, this is really weird. I remember, let's say everybody's probably done this, but if you're driving down the road and you got a child or a sack of groceries or a pet in the seat beside you, when you hit your brakes really quick, you throw your arm over naturally. I don't know if it's a mother thing, or I wasn't a mother then. It's just a natural thing to do to protect the person that you're with. Well, I remember grabbing Karen with my left arm and lunging towards her to hold her back. And the only reason I think I did that is because we were moving. We were lifting up. And that was my reaction to grab her as we lifted up. Now, I don't know anything about the car, but the car had to be lifted up too because the mileage was missing and the gas was still there. That is more bizarre than I can explain, or there's no reasoning for that. It is what it is. So I remember the entity beside me was still gray. It wasn't a rabbit. I kind of wish it was a jackrabbit, but it wasn't. It was right beside me. And I remember I could not look at it in the eyes. It was no eye contact. I would look up a little bit and look down. And I remember that happening when I was young too. When I was real young, no looking in their face. And I it's really weird. It seems to be a cultural thing. In Mexico, I noticed that a lot of the children look down all the time. They don't look up, they look down a lot. And I noticed that when I worked in Chula Vista, there was a lot of kids around the apartment complex, and they would always have their heads down. And I associated it with that when I would watch the children, and I would think, I wonder why their head's always down. And I wonder, because that's how I felt when I was young, and so I would watch them, and I would think about this as an adult. But when I was in the craft, I was on a table with my legs hanging, and I remember thinking, I really want to touch him. I really want to touch him. And he said, okay, you can touch me. But he didn't say it with his mouth. He said it in my head. Yeah, you can touch me. And I remember running my finger down his arm, which was really long and weird long fingers. And it felt like packing rubber. Packing rubber. Thin, and underneath was soft. but packing, not like our skin, more like a more like a dolphin, but like that packing stuff that you, the long sheets of it that are about this thick. And then I remember pulling my finger away and thinking, ooh, it said in my head, oh, it's not ooh, I'm just like you. You are just like me. Just like that. And I thought, I remember being like, ugh. And then calming down. And then I remember being laid down, and I don't know what happened, but that pain in my right side, I remember something was going on in my right side. And I still don't know what yet. But that's what happened. So that was in 78. And I remember a little bit during the hypnosis that a hand was passed back behind me. And then something right here was like a what I call it, pneumatic gun, like they used in the military when we all got the swine flu shots, and it injects you with air, and that's what that felt like on my neck. Because I do remember that part. Well, I saw the same images that were flashing as a child, and this time it came with a message, not just images. And it said, if you don't change the ways, if you and everyone else, you've got to learn to love each other and respect each other and take care of the world, take care of the earth. And or this that you're seeing is going to be what happens to you. Now, I took that personally as a child when I saw those. You know, was it from watching war movies with my dad? No, because this was much more extreme. This was a warning, but I was too young to understand it. But as an adult, when you get that, flash, 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 all of that happened when I was on board. And it was a very clear message. And it said, you are love. You've always been love. And you have to stay love. And that message has always been in me. And it was so hard when I went through the divorce, because it's the first time in my whole life that I've not felt loved by somebody else, and had been told, I do not love you. And that literally took me down, because I was hearing and seeing that finger, you are love. In my head, you are love. And love will fix all of this if you can just stay in love. Just always be love. That was the message. That could change the earth. It's so basic. It's just so basic to respect people, to be kind to people, to listen to what they have to say, not preconceived judgment. It changed me when I had somebody say, I do not love you. And it took me 10 years to get that love back. And this is part of getting it back, is I finally have learned I am love. Oh yeah, I have always been love. I have always given love. I don't, if I have seemed assertive, is that a good word for it? Like an assertive woman, you know what we get called other than assertive. That's only been as a strength for my family. And I was very assertive to keep all this away out of my family and out of my home. But it took this last 10 years for me to know that it's a safe time now. And having John and Debs intervene, I got in a little bit deeper, and I found that the circle that I was with really lifted me up, and understood what I had been through, because most of the people had been through that too. The conscious memories and the hypnosis memories are completely different. It's when you tell the story that they blend a little bit, just a little bit, because most of it was conscious memory. I wish I remembered more, but I think it's enough.
So the hypnosis worked. It worked beautifully. And this was a huge turning point for Susan, because she now remembered everything almost that occurred during this onboarding segment. She didn't remember exactly how she was returned. Karen, the other participant, didn't remember anything, but this incident did cause Susan to reach out to Karen. So they became friends again after not talking for quite some time. So that was another positive result of investigating her encounter. And there was another thing that turned out to be quite interesting. Susan finally found out what happened to the mystery of this missing shoe and everything that happened in the Anza Borrego Desert decades earlier. So under hypnosis, Susan was taken back to Anza Borrego. She recalled seeing herself floating up out of the Jeep where she was sleeping and shooting upwards at high speed. And as she says, I was taken out of the Jeep and I saw the shoe slip off my foot and land on a hill below. She didn't remember seeing any grays or anything of what happened that night, but she did remember being returned. As she says, when I went back, it was so amazing. I saw where my shoe was. I saw it from above, coming down. And I remember seeing every one of those guys, their bodies laying on the ground around the Jeep. It was shocking. I didn't come down hard. I saw myself being returned gently and floating down in the Jeep. I was just set back down. I don't remember any grays. I only remember the movement of lifting up, seeing my shoe slip off and fall below me, and then coming back and being floated back down. I don't remember anything else. This hypnosis brought a lot of clarity and confirmation to her early childhood encounters with the weird face looking through the window at her, because as Susan says, it was the same creature. It wasn't just visual, it's the exact same feeling. It's a knowing that the presence is the exact same presence throughout the years.
I didn't know anything about the shoe until after I had hypnosis. And at the end of the hypnosis, I saw it. And I screamed out on the videotape, "There's my shoe!" My foot. And I also saw, and I remembered the memory of seeing all those guys from above laying on the ground. So that must have been when I was coming down to the Jeep. It's the only thing I could think of. It was literally a visual of them all sleeping from above. And that's the only thing I could think of, because that's what happened during the hypnosis. It came back, but it was a very familiar memory. I just had forgotten that part, but I didn't remember. You know, that coming down and seeing them, I don't know how I ever forgot that, but it was locked away. When I saw it, I literally screamed out in the videotape, "Oh, it's the shoe!" The first thing when I came out of hypnosis, the first thing I said is, "Oh, I know I can't call the guys and tell them, but I really wish I could call the guys and tell them I know about the shoe." Grizzly's passed, and I don't know the other two guys. And Rick, I don't know if he'd be open to that, so I just haven't. But I thought it was hilarious that after all these years, 45 years later, I know where my shoe went. And it was a beautiful thing. It was so relieving and hilarious because I started laughing even in hypnosis. It just tickled me to my depth when I saw it float off in a slow motion.
So the whole hypnosis session worked out really well for Susan. It answered so many of the questions. Now she finally understood why she was having these dreams from a very young age about war and bombs and tanks in the street and people starving. This was exactly the same message she had received when she was taken on board as an adult. It's clear that the ETs are very much concerned about this. In fact, as Susan says, it showed me the urgency to stop the warlike ways on this planet or we would perish. It showed me that love and nothing but love will change the world. And this is how Susan operates. She very much allows love and truth to guide her actions, and facing her encounters head on turned out to be an incredibly healing event. She found the strength and courage to share her story, not only in my book, Humanoids in High Strangeness, but with Richard Banasek, the MUFON researcher, Earl Grey. She worked again with John Yost of Alien Abduction Answers and Deb Shakti, and started doing podcasts. So she really found a lot of strength by coming forward and sort of came full circle, and the whole event turned out to be an incredibly healing adventure. So coming forward was the right thing for her, and it really helped her to deal with this incredible encounter that had changed her life so many years ago. It was a very healing thing that she did. Now, Susan's not sure, but she thinks that the purpose of this encounter in the desert may have actually been to heal her. As she says, "I don't know everything that happened during those 9 hours, but I think I had a healing." This encounter in the desert changed her in so many ways. She's become an avid environmentalist. She appreciated the boost it gave her with her psychic abilities, which she now calls her superpowers. She has always lived her life with pure, unconditional love and positivity, and despite some of the fear and the burns she received, she is glad and grateful to have had this encounter. As she says, "I think it was positive. It's my truth, and it is what it is." Like many experiencers, she's not sure why these encounters happened to her. And as far as she knows, nobody else in her family has had an experience with an ET. She had always believed her desert encounter was an extraterrestrial experience, and now that she has had hypnosis, there is no doubt whatsoever in her mind. And it was in 2023 that she did reach out to Karen by phone, and they reunited after almost 45 years. Karen confirmed this trip. She remembered it in vivid detail, but as far as the encounter, the only thing she can remember is the missing time. And she says that she's mostly glad she doesn't remember meeting the ETs, but like Susan, she is still seeking answers and has developed an interest in this subject. After all these years of not knowing the whole story, Susan says proudly, "I am an experiencer. Now is the time to tell my story of what happened to me in 1978 in Utah. I feel almost like generations of weight have lifted off of me. There's no burden. I have most of the conscious memory of that night. But I'm so glad I reached out to John Yost and Debs Shakti for help. The whole experience has changed my life. Once I allowed myself to investigate it, it all became more comforting and less fearful. After more than 45 years of waiting to know the truth of that night, I'm thrilled I know the truth. This experience and the amazing people I have met during it have changed my life in so many wonderful ways. Retrieving those lost memories has given me great hope and clarity for my future. It's been the most amazing adventure of my lifetime, and there's plenty more to come. I will forever investigate the facts of those memories, and I will always look for that diner. MUFON has been amazing and such a great help. I feel I have done the right thing by making a report, as it's important for everyone to report the facts." So Susan, of course, is looking forward to the future with a new attitude. She is very grateful for all that happened and these paranormal things that have brought weirdness to her life. And as she says, "At this time in my life, it's time to discover more magic. I've lived it all my life, and there's no stopping it now." So there you go. That's the lifetime encounters of Susan Ware. Thank you, Susan. I can't thank you enough for sharing your story, not only with me and in my book, Humanoids in High Strangeness. So check it out, you guys, if you want to hear the whole story, because I really kind of summarized it here. But sharing it with the world, this is very difficult to do. The climate is still pretty hostile. There's a lot of skepticism and disbelief. There's ridicule. Witnesses are regularly gaslit for sharing their story. But I think it's really important for people to come forward, because I know there's a lot of people out there who are having the same kinds of experiences that Susan did. And if you want to hear more about her story, you can certainly check out the 2-hour interview that Dolly and I did on the Light Gate with Susan. Also, check out the film by Steve Neal, The Jackrabbit Abduction. Remember, this was the case that MUFON chose as the case of the year for 2023. Thanks quite much to the hard work of Earl Grey and Richard Banasek, who really helped Susan to investigate her encounter. So it's truly an amazing case. I think it shows really well how a person can move on a journey through fear and confusion to understanding and healing. It's amazing to me how many people get this same sort of message that humanity has become far too violent and that we are on the pathway towards self-destruction. This is the message ETs give over and over again. So it's really up to us to listen, and I think this is why it's so important that people like Susan come forward with their encounters. So thank you, Susan, once again. You know I love you dearly. I love all of you too. Thank you so much for watching. I truly appreciate it. Until next time, keep asking those questions. Keep searching for the truth. Most important of all, keep having fun, and I'll see you next time.